Welcome, friends and family. People here in the loft, people there in the Zoom room, people out there in Facebook Live land. Welcome to another Empathy with Nature, Thinking Like a Plant, where we are exploring perspectives and practices to reconnect to the true nature of nature. And we are just in the beginning stages of this series, this being the second session. And I'd like to take a moment to recap a bit of what we looked at in the first session, because it's important to understand the foundation we're starting from. You could say the ground out of which the rest of this work will grow, you could say. So in the first session, which was called What's Wrong with Me? What's Wrong with We? We saw how the more critical epidemic afflicting humanity, now spanning centuries of time, is this sense of disconnect and alienation we have. We are not only at times experiencing disconnect from one another, but we're also experiencing even a disconnection from ourselves. This has much to do with the fact that we are becoming increasingly estranged from nature. Do we even know what nature is? And if we don't, can we even know what our nature is? These are primary questions that need to be addressed with some vigor. Otherwise, our estrangement to nature may lead to more problems than our technology can solve. Why? Because our technologies may be treating more the symptoms of problems rather than the causes of problems. We are extending our senses daily with technology, with increasingly more powerful microscopes and telescopes, and even advanced technologies that can penetrate into realms where our senses cannot go. But are we any closer to the true nature of nature? As I pointed out in session 1, the problem is the answer to the question, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with we? Is that we have all grown up in a philosophical environment, one that informs the modern version of science that permeates our Western culture, with what is called Cartesian dualism. When René Descartes announced, "I think, therefore I am," there was one word he used in that sentence that he used twice. I. I think, therefore I am. This significantly pointed to a newly emerging part of the human nature, the I, which in Latin is the word ego. The emerging ego. So the I am egoic self, the part that can think not only about itself and this awakening ability to think for oneself, but to be able to think about an infinite number of things other than the self, really lies at the heart of the problem and the solution. This statement, "I think, therefore I am," really set this Cartesian dualism in motion, where the I am an egoic self and you are not me, and I can think about you, and I can think whatever I want to think about you, because I am free to think. I'm a free thinker, free to think whatever I want to think. But does that actually make me free? Herein lies the rub. If we are free to think whatever we want, are we actually accurate in what we think? Because if I am free to think accurately about something, then I must be free to think inaccurately about something. And what is thinking anyways? What is thinking anyways? This series is called Thinking Like a Plant. So we're calling into question the nature of thinking and the potential of thinking. So far in our survey of the philosophy of science, both the power and the problem of the human eye's capacity to think is that it has caused a split. It has set a wedge, created a dualism between the I and the other, the not I, you could say. It has even set a split between the sense of our own mind and body. And this has led to a systematic disease, a dis-ease, known as Cartesian anxiety, where we are all experiencing this low-grade, semi-conscious anxiety, and I dare say even depression, because a deep part of us feels this unbridgeable, irreconcilable divide between the inner life of the self and everything else outside of the self. This is known as Cartesian anxiety. Take a moment to tune in and see if you can sense this Cartesian anxiety within yourself. So take a moment to tune in to feel this separation between you and that which is not you. I am I and you are you. And I feel that separation, the distance, not only a physical distance, but something of an invisible sense of distance as well. So how do we overcome this divide, this gap, this abyss? By thinking about it? Well, this is apparently what created it, the thinking. And even great minds like Immanuel Kant, after a lifetime of thinking about it, had to basically shrug his shoulders and say he had no solution to this human dilemma. And so much intellectual debate, so many of the great philosophers of the Renaissance and the Age of Reason left a legacy that said, you really can't know anything for sure. And so the Cartesian anxiety has prevailed, and the sense of disconnect and alienation. And it's painful. It's painful, and continues to be painful. Even with the tremendous amount of knowledge we have amassed over the past few centuries. Even lots of people no longer take solace in the ancient religions anymore. So what is the solution to this problem of what's wrong with me? What's wrong with we? How can we make it right? Well, one thing we know for sure, we are surrounded by nature, right? Nature is the environment that has born us. We are born of nature. And nature has brought us this far. And so perhaps nature may have something to say in order for us to go even further in this journey. Perhaps we need to listen to nature as a teacher, guide, and leader. The problem is not necessarily our thinking capacity, as I pointed out. It is a problem, but maybe that's not really fair to put it all on this capacity to think, because I know in some spiritual movements people try to avoid thinking, or they think thinking is not spiritual. But the type of thinking that tends to objectify things, or what Craig Holdridge, my mentor from the Nature Institute, in the opening chapter of his book, Thinking Like a Plant, he calls this object thinking, that we objectify things with object thinking. And this is the tendency in which we've been trained in our schooling and brought up in, this objective thinking, object thinking, where we objectify things outside of ourselves. And we do that as a means to try and understand them. Now, this is known as the Newtonian way of sciencing, based on the methodology pioneered by Sir Isaac Newton. And that is all fine and well, this Newtonian approach to science, in its proper place and in its proper proportion. The problem is that enough? Is that approach to nature enough to really be able to know it? So this is the question raised in the first chapter of Craig's book, the first chapter called From Object Thinking to Living Thinking. Living thinking. Living thinking. What is living thinking? Just going to put that out as a question, let that kind of hang in the air for a moment. What is living thinking? And I want to take a break from thinking about thinking for a moment and return to the exercise you were given last session as the nature play assignment, which I hope you've been doing every day. And if you haven't done it today, that's okay, because we're going to do it today, right now. So first off, everyone needs to get some pencil crayons or some crayons and something to draw on. The assignment was to take some time each day, or even several times a day, to first off contemplate something that is living, something that is growing, flourishing, so forth, and to sense into it. To sense into it. And when I say sense into it, yes, we use our senses, and in particular, we use our visual sense when we're looking at something. But we soon realize we're using something other than our five senses. We have these capacities of five senses, the seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. But we have other senses beyond the five senses, the five physical senses. The five physical senses allow us to see and experience the physical realm. But we have senses beyond the five physical senses, which allows us to sense things beyond the reach of the physical senses. You might think of it as kind of an advanced technology that we have. And that is what we want to awaken here in these practices and learning to think like a plant. This is part of what we mean when we refer to living thinking. It is a form of thinking that we're doing, but is a form of transformed or advanced thinking, living sensing. And in this case, this living sensing capacity is what we're going to use to tune in to that which is first living, thriving, blooming. And then secondly, the other half of the exercise is to sense into that which is dying, withering, and decaying. Right? So we're going to do that here in the loft, and I'm going to have the camera here so people there in Zoom land and so forth can do it through the camera, through the gift of the internet. And yes, it does work going through technology. You can still sense into things that are living and things that are dying. Living flowers, still quite alive looking. So I'm just going to go into silence and allow you to really intently and intensively contemplate the quality of this bouquet of living flowers. You can be looking at details, but then you can also zoom out to an overall sense of the quality of this. Now we're going to move on to the next one, which is going to give a contrasting quality. obviously in the latter stages of its existence, withering, decaying, dying. So sense into that. And back to the first one. Oh. Can move a little more quickly if you like. And we can even hold both in view at the same time. Need to be playful with this because we're really approaching it in a living way. And just for fun and contrast, I thought I would also put a third one here on the piano. Which is, anyone guess? Right. They are synthetically manufactured, pretty lifelike looking, real. They've fooled a few people, but you guys are pretty astute here because you are looking with more than your physical senses, right? But just feel into the quality of that beyond the physical looking. In comparison, that's something that was alive and now dead, but nonetheless organic. And lastly, we'll end off on the nice fresh bouquet. All right. So we're going to take this one step further to really engage you even more. And so with your paper and pencil crayons, on the one page to draw the sense of something that's living, not draw it as if you were like painting a realist painting, but really the sense of livingness as it comes through your hand to draw it. And then on the other page, likewise, something that's dying and decaying. Just the quality of that. It's not an art piece you're doing, but capturing a qualitative sense. Yeah, I mean, I have here mine that was first the living thing and the sense of something living. And on the one hand, it was something that was exuding out, something that was shining out, and also something that was being received in. A sense of giving and receiving I felt in this livingness. And I had to do something that looked like a hand kind of waving. It was like acknowledgement of one living being to another. So, yeah, then there was the second one, sense of something dying, decaying, and it seemed like there was something missing above and below, that there was really nothing in the space that was being exuded. Same with the living one. Although I had to put a little bit of radiance here because there's something sweet. Something's being exuded when something's dying. It's not like it's dying, it's bad, it's dead, no, it's bad. But there's something sweet in that stage. So there was a little bit of exudant there. But yeah, going up and returning back to the earth. That's why I put those arrows. It's definitely making a U-turn in its growth to go back down to the earth. Anyone else want to come up and show their picture here? I can show it on the camera. You don't have to come on camera. Nobody's going to be on camera for these recordings. But you can talk about... Yeah, okay, so your first one here, what can you say about that?
So that's the living one, just sort of an idea of motion, movement, fluidity, things sort of interacting and joining together, and like you said, sort of radiating out. So that was just somewhat of what came out. Started with one swirl and just went from there. Kind of like a plant, I guess, that sort of spawns out of one place and grows.
Grows, and yet this interconnectedness of it all, that, yeah, it stems from one root, and but goes in all these different directions, but it really is connected as a oneness, which reminds me of a very interesting statement that Goethe makes, good old Goethe, how he says really there's just one plant on the entire earth. There's really just one plant, and it's all stemming from plantness.
Yeah, well, that was part of it too. This, you can't see where it's really coming from. There isn't sort of a starting point.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes.
When
No
you look
starting
at it,
point.
It doesn't really start anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Let's have a look at the converse.
It's upside down.
Oh, it's upside down.
Let's look at that one. Was a little rushed because I ran out of time.
Oh dear.
But just sort of a downward motion. I guess the idea of this sort of energy coming out, and eventually the black hole of where it's seeping out of, maybe coming back to the earth. But I really sort of rethought it when you said, we always think of dying, well, not always, but sometimes as a sad thing and a dark thing, whereas it's just another chapter of the energy moving on. So I guess I took the first approach, but was just trying to convey the idea of the energy draining out.
Yeah, which is valid. You focused on one aspect of it. We can't necessarily capture the whole sense of something.
Mm-hmm.
But you want to pass these around for others? Anyone else? That's such a great example of what Michael did here, where he wasn't trying to draw a plant. He was really trying to capture the essence of something, the sense he was feeling of, as you said, contraction,
Yes.
and you used the word draining.
Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm. So it's a symbolic form of a certain qualitative essence, and that's really an important step, moving forward in developing our capacities and thinking like a plant, to take a step away from what the physical senses dictate, and not being fooled into thinking that is all there is to it, but there's much more going on. The point here is really to get familiar and comfortable with this practice so you can do it at home, where get some paper, some pencil, crayons, and take 20 minutes to do the contemplation, followed by the drawing. And the drawing will draw out of you more and more of this capacity. So let's talk a bit more about this qualitative sense that we're tuning into, and how this qualitative science is in contrast to quantitative science, which we've all learned, right, in school, high school, and whatnot, this Newtonian approach to science, where we weigh things and measure them and name them and categorize them. But in this other approach, which we can refer to as the approach really advocated by Goethe, so we can call it Goethean science as opposed to Newtonian science. What is it we're doing? What is it we're doing when we are connecting to a felt sense of something, as opposed to trying to name it and categorize it, which can be much more of a clinical approach, right? And which tends to focus on the outer manifestation of things. And we've become exceedingly good at knowing about the outer manifestation of things through this Newtonian methodology. But in employing a Goethean approach to the phenomenon of nature, which is why it's sometimes referred to as phenomenology, this Goethean approach known as phenomenology, we are endeavoring to know something about the object by approaching it qualitatively, which requires something more than just our five senses. We need to employ these other senses in order to tune in to the qualities of the object. So we need to become active in our inner life in new ways. We need to become active in living ways, which is why Craig refers to this approach as living thinking, right, versus object thinking. And this is why on the front of his book it says, a living science for life. A living science for life. So, what makes it a living science? It is due to what is living in the scientist. It's a living science due to what is living in the scientist, or even how the scientist is living. How the scientist is living inside. And who are the scientists? We are the scientists. We are the scientists. Right? And science is about knowing. And to science is a verb. It's an action. It's a living action. It's an inside living action, which we're all capable of. And we're all capable of developing this, which is the thing that is going to give us living knowing, as opposed to just the accumulation of facts, which isn't necessarily a knowing at all. Accumulating facts isn't necessarily a knowing at all, at least not a living knowing. With facts, we get facts, right? Facts, 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 which can actually get you all fact up. And so let me recap the quote I gave last time, a quote from Goethe, where he says, if we want to behold nature in a living way, we must follow her example and make ourselves as mobile and flexible as nature herself. I'll repeat that. If we want to behold nature in a living way, we must follow her example and make ourselves as mobile and flexible as nature herself. So I want to do this self-test again, which we did last time, to see how mobile and flexible you are in your inner life at this time, at this moment. So on the scale of 0 to 10, where 0 being the lowest and 10 being the highest, what number spontaneously comes to mind to indicate your current state of inner mobility between 0 and 10? Couple of sevens over there. All right. Good match. So you can mark it down if you want, and compare it to with what you got last time, right? Because people that were here last time also did this test. And has it gone up since last time, having done this exercise every day of the week, sitting with things sitting with things that are dying? Has that increased your inner mobility and flexibility, your living thinking? Last session, we also compiled a list of adjectives that describe someone who is the opposite of being flexible and mobile in their thinking. We came up with adjectives like rigid, fixed, static, dogmatic, stubborn, defensive, narrow-minded, judgmental, suppressed, oppressed, even muzzled, shy, wilted, controlled, or even just plain old stuck. Think of those adjectives. Can you imagine if those adjectives were applied to a plant itself? If you had a plant that was oppressed, suppressed, stubborn, defensive, narrow-minded, what would that plant look like? A cactus. Prickly. Prickly in its thinking. And so to recap one other point from the first session, before we move forward into some other things, we considered that there are really two types of thinking, or two sides to thinking. There's the analytical and the intuitive. And it's not really about which one is superior and which one is inferior to the other, but that they are both really meant to work together. And in fact, they really are working together a lot of the time more than we realize. That the intuitive is playing into the analytical and the analytical is playing into the intuitive. If we really were paying attention and thought about it, we would realize that there is this intertwining of these two sides of thinking most of the time. But we've not been taught to pay attention to this. The point being is that a plant illustrates both these sides of cognitive activity. There is this linear growth of a plant. It's kind of following a logic dictated by physical laws, a lawfulness that adheres to this crystalline and mechanical level of things in the physical realm. So, yeah, kind of an analytical side, you could say. And then there's also the fact that the plant is an alive being. And even though it's going through seemingly mechanical stages, it is living. It's a living being that's growing. It grows. It even reproduces other living beings. How incredible is that? There's this livingness, you could say intuitiveness, to the plant in this regard. So in these two ways, a plant is a vivid illustration externally of both the analytical and intuitive ways that we can be in our inner life. So I'd like to read a paragraph from the opening page of Craig Holdred's book, Thinking Like a Plant, which I'm studying because he's my mentor down at the Nature Institute in New York State, where I spent a couple of weeks of residency last summer. And I'm continuing to study through this year and into a residency again next summer. So here he says on the very first page, clearly, we can't put much hope in our physical ability to wander out into the yard, take root, and then grow by using the sun's light and taking in air, water, and a paltry amount of minerals. But we can put our hope in our ability to become plant-like thinkers, How might the world look if we as human beings were able to think the way a plant grows? Imagine gaining such flexibility of thought that our ideas were no longer rigid, static, and object-like, but grew, transformed, and when necessary, died away. And as with plant form, what if our actions grew out of a context-sensitive relation to the world we inhabit? Isn't that a revolution worth striving for? I'll repeat that last sentence. Isn't that a revolution worth striving for? Here Craig is speaking of a revolution worth striving for. I think this strikes a huge note. We are really needing a revolution at this time in our earthly evolution. The earth itself is already in revolution, right? The earth is revolving continuously, and nature is in constant revolution, revolving through the seasons of the year. What Craig is calling for is a revolution in human consciousness, a revolution to our inner life, a revolution from within. But how does one go about this? You might be asking, how does one go about this in a way that is constructive and not destructive, as cultural revolutions can sometimes be? This important question brings us face to face with the realities of nature and the need to return to the wisdom of nature, who is already in revolution mode. We need to return to nature as our teacher, our guide, and our leader. Returning to Craig's book once more, the following the sentence that incites us into revolution, he says, "In this book, I want to show that if we are interested in addressing our present-day unsustainable relation to the planet in a deep way, our way of thinking about the world needs radical reorientation. And as far as I can tell, there is no better model for sustainable human thinking than the plant." So he says we need a revolution, but the right kind of revolution if we are to hope for a sustainable future. And so in today's session, I want to now turn to the book of nature, and to the plant world in particular, to guide us with its wisdom, to engage us in a revolution that will secure a sustainable future out of sustainable thinking. And in looking to the plant, if there's one thing we could say about a plant, it is a certain kind of being. In a word, transformational. Transformational. We can consider the plant as a transformational being, a being that not only grows, but goes through a metamorphosis as it goes through stages. It's continually morphing as it goes through its stages of growth. Well, you might say, just as an argument to that, well, that a mineral, a stone, a rock, is also a transformational being, right? And to a degree, one would be correct. The mineral earth is constantly going through transformation, taking on new shapes and forms. A rock is eroded by the elements. It decays, dissolves, goes back to a minuscule crystalline form, only to rise again in another rock, or perhaps an ocean floor, or a mountain. So the mineral world is also, to a certain extent, a transformational being. But there's one big distinction between a rock as a transformational being and a plant as a transformational being. There is an impulse to grow and transform that comes from within the plant itself. The impulse to grow and transform comes from within the plant itself. Yes, a plant is subject to the same external elements as a rock. It's impacted by the weather, the rain, the heat, the cooling, pressure, and so forth. And all of this carries a rock through its lifespan and metamorphosis. For example, taking a piece of carbon to being a diamond. Whereas with a plant, there is something within it that seeks to come out, seeks to express itself. And in a way, it uses these external elements of the weather, of the earth, the water, the wind, the heat of the sun. It uses these external elements to carry itself through its stages from seed to bloom. And that is what distinguishes a plant as a transformational being, a living transformational being, as opposed to a mineral. Another interesting point to note about a plant is that through the various stages of growth, it is forming new and different organs. Right? This stands in contrast actually to humans. A human, when born, is born with all its organs already formed. When you're born, those organs that you have now were already formed. The organs may grow larger, especially in the first years of life. As you grow larger physically, the organs will grow larger, but they were already formed when you emerged from the womb. The heart, the liver, kidneys, the skin, the eyes, and so forth were already formed. But it's not so with a plant. A plant is different in this regard. When a plant emerges out of its seed, it is starting a journey where new and different organs are continually appearing, as if from nowhere, as it goes through its various stages, from the seed, then to stalk, then leaves appear, then a calyx, the bloom, the fruit, etc. New organs are emerging on its living journey. And so one could say that the plant teaches us about the formation of new organs as it goes through stages of development. Is this teaching us something about our inner development? Is what a plant is externalizing, is that teaching us, showing us wisdom about our inner development? The development of our outer shell is finished in a sense, all the organs fully formed, but our inner life is unfinished. It's unfinished. Is the plant telling us that our inner life needs to go through stages of development, developing new organs in order to have a sustainable inner life? These are big questions we're putting to the book of nature tonight. And so part of our journey in this series of thinking like a plant is to look at a plant systematically, examining its stages to see what the book of nature can tell us about our inner development. And because we're just at the beginning of this transformational journey here in session 2, we could say we are just at the seed stage. And so we'll begin this evening with the examination of the seed in our systematic examination of the wisdom of a plant as it goes through stages of organ development. So if we were to ask a botanist what a seed is, you might get a definition, right? Some facts, a Newtonian approach to the question. But getting facts and so forth, are we any closer to knowing a seed? What we're about to do is a Goethean approach to knowing a seed, which, as I said earlier, is sometimes referred to as the phenomenological approach, which in contrast to sitting with a dictionary definition of a seed, we're going to spend time with the seed itself. How revolutionary is that? We will spend time with the phenomenon of a seed. And to do this, we're going to engage with another exercise, again from Rudolf Steiner's classic text on personal development, How to Know Higher Worlds. Same place where we got the first exercise when we were contemplating the living plant and dying plant. And before that, let me give you a bit of background as to why we are getting Goethe's work filtered through Rudolf Steiner. This is because Rudolf Steiner, after he finished his graduate studies in Germany, was chosen to be the person to assemble and catalog all of Goethe's scientific writings. Quite an honored and distinguished position. And to do this, he had to move to Weimar, Germany, and spend 5 years there. Weimar, Germany is the town where Goethe had lived and done his work. And so Steiner went there and became seriously immersed in the world of Goethean thought and did the work of assembling and cataloging all of Goethe's scientific writings. And at the end of that, Rudolf Steiner came out with his own first book called The Theory of Knowledge Implicit in Goethe's World Conception. The Theory of Knowledge Implicit in Goethe's World Conception. I love long titles like that. It's just so much to take in and chew on. I love creating my own long titles. And this book was published in 1886 and still stands as an important benchmark in the evolution of philosophical scientific thought, even to today. Why? Well, because while much of the world is still suffering from this Cartesian dualism and sense of disconnect and the seemingly insurmountable impasse in terms of knowing the world for what it really is, Goethe stood in contrast by researching and demonstrating these so-called limits, demonstrating that these so-called limits could be transcended. But it would take a different kind of interactivity to do it, a different kind of sciencing, and even a different kind of scientist. So Goethe was actually calling for revolution in science even back then, which was then echoed through the work of Rudolf Steiner and then further echoed by living researchers like Craig Holdridge. So we find much in Rudolf Steiner's work an elaboration on the how of doing this, the how of Goethean science, the how of phenomenology, giving specific exercises, practices, things we can actually do and not just theory and ideas taking up CPU in the brain, right? But actual things we can do, as the practice that we did today and you got last week. Specific exercises that, if taken up, actually done with commitment and vigor, will undoubtedly produce favorable changes in your inner life. They will produce results. They will produce fruit. They will produce a revolution within. So we're going to do what's known as the seed exercise. And everyone needs a seed. So I'm going to pass around this bowl. Help yourself. There's a variety of seeds in there, so whatever suits your fancy. And hopefully you people there in Zoom land and Facebook Live did as I asked last week, was to come prepared with a seed. But if you haven't, don't worry about it, because I'm going to put the camera on these objects here this evening, and you can tune in through the camera, and it does work. And for this exercise, we're also going to have a second object, something that is not a seed, something artificial. And I've got a bag of green glass things that are kind of seed-like, seed-sized. So I'll pass the bag around and take one of those. And you can keep that. You can keep that. You can keep the seed, and you can keep this little green glass. This artificial thing, this human synthesized thing, synthetic. So we have something that is artificial, and then a seed which is living. Now I want to stop right there. It seems kind of obvious that this is not living, but can we say that a seed is a living thing? Exactly. That's the word I was fishing for. Potential. Life potential in the seed, because the seed contains life within it, as we know. So I'm going to explain this exercise first off, drawing, as I said, from Rudolf Steiner's book, How to Know Higher Worlds, where he lays out this exercise in detail. And he tells us first to look at the seed with as much precise detail as possible, using the senses, particularly sight and touch, right? But you could also smell it, taste it if you want, and describe it, to actually describe things of it. So you want to be looking at it in detail with the senses and describing aspects of it. That's kind of the Newtonian approach. We're really starting with that, a Newtonian approach. Then we want to bring some thought energy to it. This is what Steiner says in the text, quoting him now, to think this thought. The seed, if planted in the ground, will grow into a complex plant. We visualize the plant. We make the plant present to us. We build it up in imagination. Then we think, what I now visualize in my imagination, forces of earth and light will later in reality draw forth from this small seed. But if this were an artificial seed, an artificial copy, so perfect that my eyes could not distinguish it from the real seed, then no forces of earth and light would ever be able to draw forth such a plant from it. Continuing to quote from the text. If we can clearly form this thought and bring it to life within us, then we'll be able to form the next thought easily and with the right feeling. Within the seed already lies concealed what, as the force of the whole plant, later grows out of it. The artificial copy of the seed has no such force. Yet to my eyes, both seeds look the same. Therefore, the real seed contains something invisible that is absent to the copy. Thoughts and feelings should now focus on this invisible reality. We must imagine that this invisible force or reality will, in the course of time, change into the visible plant, whose color and form we will be able to see before us. We should hold the thought, hold the thought, the invisible will become visible. The invisible will become visible. Steiner goes on to say that when doing this exercise, it needs to be done with intensity, to the exclusion of anything else in our inner life. So obviously we would only do this for short periods, like for a minute, a couple of minutes. He also emphasizes that the thought and feeling need to be united in doing these exercises. Right? This is what makes it different from the Newtonian methodology, where feelings are kept out. Feelings are kept at bay. Feelings are kept out of the lab, right? But conversely, here we want to intently and intensively join thought and feeling together in the observation of this nature phenomenon. So then comes the really important part. Ready for this? This is kind of the crescendoing of this practice. He says that when it is done successfully, we will become conscious of a new force within us, which in fact is the creation of a new perception. In fact, it's coming from the creation, it's the creation of a new organ. This new force producing a new perception is really the creation of a new inner organ. This is what the exercise will produce in kind of the crescendoing, the fruition of it. Further, he says that this new sense, beyond our physical senses, may give us an impression that the seed is enclosed in a small cloud of light, an aura, or that we may even sense a kind of flame at the center of the seed. We may even receive impressions of colors such as blue or purple at the edges or at the center of the seed. So before anyone starts to think this is all kind of woo-woo, seeing auras and whatnot around seeds, let us see for ourselves and know for ourselves by doing this exercise, experiencing this phenomenon, and see how far we can go in awakening this new force, this new perception, this new organ within us. Okay, enough explanation. I am going to put these two things on the table here. I've got the light on. There's the seed. And there's an artificial thing that's kind of like a copy. Table kind of looks messy because it's an art table. So, back to the beginning here. Just going to walk you through this again, and you can follow along doing the exercise. And these instructions I will put on the web page with all the nature play assignments, so you can go there, or even better, get a copy of this book by Rudolf Steiner where he lays out these instructions. It's a great book. It's well worth owning, and it's a book that I use in the spiritual boot camp as part of the studies. So yeah, first tuning into the seed, this sense of light potential that's there. But actually, first step is to look at it with our senses, looking at it in detail, looking at it up close, touching it, seeing it, perhaps smelling and tasting if you really wanted to. And being with this thought, this seed, if planted in the ground, will grow into a complex plant. So try to visualize what that plant might look like. It doesn't have to be the exact plant that corresponds to that seed, but something that is plant-like. Let's build up that image in your imagination. Then thinking to ourselves, what I now visualize in my imagination, later forces of light and earth will draw forth from this small seed. But in contrast, this artificial thing next to it, this artificial copy, which if we had one, we could have one that's so perfect it looks exactly like the seed, we wouldn't tell the difference, but we would know. The artificial one would never be drawn out into being a plant by the forces of light and warmth. So we really want to work with the thought, having this thought within us that says within the seed already lies concealed the forces of the whole plant that will grow out of it, whereas the artificial one has no such force. Therefore, the real seed contains something invisible that is absent in the other. So now we're trying to focus our feeling sense on this invisible reality. The invisible reality which we could imagine in our mind's eye, but we can also feel it as a felt sense, as a new perception out of a new organ that's growing in us. We imagine how this invisible force that we're tuning into will at some point become visible, come into form and color before us. This invisible force we can feel and tune into will become visible. We need to be thinking these thoughts, working with the inner image, imagination, and also working with our feeling realm. Very important in the Goethean phenomenological approach. We use our feelings to tune in to the invisible realities. And in this case, we might even sense a flame, not a physical flame, but a sense of flameness at the center of the seed. Perhaps receive impressions of color, not physical colors, but just the impression of colors, the colorness, perhaps purple or blue, and may even sense that the seed is enclosed in a small cloud of light or aura. Just going to leave you in silence for a few moments to be with all of that. Later, but of course you can continue to do this exercise on your own at home alone. I'd encourage it because, as you see, it's going to produce results or roses. To go back to the poem I read last week, results or roses. When we dig into things, we get results and roses. So that's really the purpose of this series, is to empower people with perspectives and practices that will produce results, produce new interactivity. So here is my impression. Wasn't really trying to do anything that looked like a seed, but just a sense of something that had concentric circles, a sense of something moving out, but also these arrows showing something moving in from the periphery, and here something kind of ethereal at the periphery, moving in, and simultaneously something that is going to move out. So kind of a polarity of forces. Yes, and that is part of the exercise, is to develop an image, an inner image. The image, the symbol we hold in mind becomes kind of a gateway, a portal to the invisible. We have the visible object and the physical object, but then we create an image of the invisible future of it. Becomes like a portal to touch, to access the invisible potential, which you made visible in your drawing. So the idea is really to connect with the larger reality of the plant, the part that's there, but not visible. And we'll get into another exercise next week that takes us even further into this contact with the living being of the plant. As I said, I'll post this on the web page that has all the Nature Play assignments. So you can look there, you can copy it and print it off so you can have it as a reference to guide you, because there's a few different moving parts to this. Don't assume it's just about sitting with the seed. There's really something a bit more sophisticated to this exercise where you have to build up certain thoughts about it and imagery and so forth. So I really want you to get the most out of this by doing it as fully as possible. Finishing off, I want to just state how there's three things. There's three ways of knowing. So we can know things with our senses, as we've done here with the seed. We've known that through our senses. And we can also know things through our extended senses. When I say extended senses, I mean technology. Like we can develop microscopes and telescopes. We could put the seed under the microscope and we could actually know more about it by looking at it microscopically. So that's the second way of increasing our knowing. But then the third way is to realize we're capable of going beyond our senses. We can go beyond our senses to develop other senses, higher senses, senses that take us beyond the physical, that allow us to have perceptions that are beyond just what we perceive physically. And that comes out of the development of organs, new organs, as we see illustrated in a plant. A plant is developing new organs at each stage of its growth. It's externalizing new organs. And this, as I said earlier, book of nature is teaching us something about our needs for our inner development, our own plant nature. So more about that coming up in the subsequent sessions. We've got 5 more sessions, so lots more to come. But I want to give you now the Nature Play assignment for this week. And I say for this week, but also for the rest of your life, which will be posted on the page. But yeah, first one is to do what we just did. Contemplate every day a seed and sense into its invisible qualities, its potential to become a full plant, and compare that with something that is not a living seed, just for contrast, and see what a qualitatively different felt sense there is between the two. And following that, if you want, you can take some time to draw your impressions of these two different states on a piece of paper. Next of all, you can continue with the practices from previous sessions. As we build up these practices, you're going to have a whole toolbox full of tools and practices. And then lastly, the fourth exercise is, of course, the Ruckshell, the number one practice for the rest of your life, which is to take a few minutes each day to review the events of the day in reverse order. Review the day in reverse order, seeing yourself from an objective perspective. Yeah, we're developing our objective perspective of things. And this is a way to strengthen many things in yourself, including the capacity for mental picturing, your memory of things, and most of all, empathy. This really important capacity for empathy, which we'll be talking about more in future sessions. Until then, may the forest be with you.